Hello, welcome. I wonder how many people have any idea what this is. It's usually in shades of green, often sometimes darker, sometimes lighter than this one. Unfortunately, this one's just broken its top off. Traditionally, it was hung always in the east window, often near the coast, but gradually in time it spread further and further in. So, I wonder if you've got any idea how this came about. This is actually what we call a witch's ball, and it was designed to ward off evil spirits and witches, so it was hung in a window. In those days, back in the 17th, 18th century, it was a very real thing. People were very, very concerned about it. Witches, they believed, could transform. They could turn into cats, hares, bats, and they could come into openings into the house. Obviously doors, windows, well, most of the time they're closed. So one of the biggest worries was the chimney. The chimney flue. It came straight to the house. It was never closed. And potentially evil spirits could come down it. So what they did, they designed things to try and prevent this from happening. And nowadays we call them autotrophic marks. But I like the old term witches marks. I think they're much, much better. Now, funny enough, I was in the Murderers Court just recently, actually, at Lyndhurst at the King's House. And we have an old wooden dock there. And I had to make what we call a presentment, talking about the forest. And I climbed up into this dock to make my presentment. And I had to pause for a second because there on the side of that dock was witches' marks. Now, they take different forms. And these witches' marks on this dock were in the shape of a V and an M carved into each other. And that stood for the Virgin Mary. And the idea was to say this would ward off evil spirits. But also we noticed in the forest as well, and there's another good example as well in the library at the King's House at Lyndhurst, of what we call a daisy wheel. Now these are circles with like a pattern of petals carved inside of it. And the idea was that these mesmerises the witches and it wards off evil. Now for a long time, no one could actually work out how they did this, how they made such perfect circles. I mean, in those days, you wouldn't have compasses. It just wasn't handy. And so there's a new school of thought now that's just come out, and I've had a go myself, and it does seem to work. One thing that was very, very common in rural areas was hand sheep shears. Now, this is a set I've got. I mean, this one's not particularly very old, and they haven't really changed in design. But it would act as a compass. And I won't put it on the table because I will be in trouble. But you put one end down, and you can score the circle. And then very quite simply, how to produce petals from it. So this was readily available. So it's now thought that these witches' marks, these daisy wheels, were made by compasses. Now, the last person in England, or in Britain actually, was tried for witchcraft in 1944, and a woman called Helen Duncan. And she got 9 months. And so even up till recently, and possibly in still some people's living memory, people could still get tried for this. Now, as you drive around the forest, you'll still see items left over from the days when witchcraft was extremely worrying. People were very worried about it. And one of the plants that you'll often see here in the forest is the holly. Now, I've got a piece there I've just picked earlier on this morning. Now, the holly was thought to ward off witches. I say, when you're driving around the forest, you'll notice that a lot of old cottages will have holly bushes growing outside their front door. And again, I say, keep the witches or the evil spirits away. But then it was also thought that the witches travelled along the hedgerows. I'm not entirely sure how they'll do that, but that's what was considered that the way the means of transport for them. And so what they did, they used to plant holly within the hedgerows, and this stopped the witches from travelling up it. But witches weren't always bad. Now, in the forest, we had a term called Cunning Folk. Now, these were maybe what we call white witches, as opposed to the darker, the black witches. But they were the healers of the time. And their job was to act like doctors of the community. And they practiced midwifery. They practiced the herbal side of it. I mean, they would still do spells, and I've heard of stories about making love potions and this sort of thing. But it was still very, very common. And my grandmother, of all people, and she wasn't a particularly tall woman, she was a little lady with grey hair. Towards the end of her life, she sort of walked with a stick. She wasn't very, very house proud. I mean, the house was always a bit untidy. But what a fantastic cook. And there was always food in the pantry. But what she did, and I always remember it, she practiced herbalism. And she would have been known in those days as a cunning folk or cunning woman. Anyway, she used to practice this herbalism. And she had herbs growing in the garden, up the streams, all over the place. And she used to go out to the forest and collect whatever she could find. And she had some quite notable successes. I mean, people still used to come to her with their ailments and with their problems. And I remember one chap turning up and he had kidney stones. And he was due to have quite a big operation to have one of his kidney stones removed. Anyway, she consulted her books and for a couple of days, and then she got this chap to come back. And she came up with this remedy for him. Now, it involves a grass called couch, or some people call it couch grass, and it's a gardener's nightmare. It has thick rhizomes on the bottom of it, and if you chop up these roots, they just grow continuously. Now, here on the farm, luckily, I don't really have couch grass, but I think I found a piece very, very similar, and it has the root system. And so what she did, she dried these roots out, she ground them up, made them into like a bit of a sort of paste type powder, and then got this chap to drink it twice a day for 4 or 5 days, make a tea out of it. And it cured him. He came back absolutely fine. And she was chuffed to bits with this. Other things she used to make up as well. We used to hold a comfrey. It used to grow down by the stream. And it's a thick sort of leafed plant. And it was great for bruises and bumps and this sort of thing. And she made it into an ointment. Now, I'm trying to remember what she mixed it with. And I can't really recall what she made this cream from. But she ground these leaves up and infused them into this cream. And if we had bumps and scrapes, then we used to put those on. But there was also some very eccentric sort of ideas of what she used to do. And I always remember when I was studying, when I was at school and my exams were coming up, and we used to have borage. Now, borage is a plant that's got very furry leaves, little blue flowers. And we used to weave these into our hair when we were studying, because what she said was that it stimulated the blood flow. And so if you stimulated your head, your scalp with these leaves, then you could study, and learn a lot more. And so I remember as a child, my brother and I sitting there with borage leaves wrapped into our hair. But there's always some truth in something. And I later on in life, I did look this up. And sure enough, a few hundred years ago, the scholars in Oxford used to do the same. Used to use these borage leaves and put them in. Well, my grandmother went on, and she even had a radio programme on a local radio station called Radio Solent. And people used to write in with their problems or ring in, and used to recommend different things. I'm not sure technically we could do that nowadays. But she used to have all these herbs hanging in her pantry in the hallway. And I used to walk into the pantry to go and pick up a bottle of pears or whatever I was going to go for, and have to dodge all these plants hanging down. So she was what we called a cunning folk. And they were the good witches. And that's still today, it's still practiced. A good friend of mine, his wife, and she's the high priestess of the New Forest. But they're not harmful, and I think being a farmer, you can identify more sometimes with the seasons, the woods, the trees, everything that grows. It all comes together, and sometimes you actually can look at that and fully understand where they're coming from. Well, witches, I say, and my grandmother, two different sides of the story. They're not always bad. You got good ones as well. And I always remember now looking back on my grandmother fond memories of all her medicines and potions. And she truly believed in it. But I say, she healed people and it did work. So often not, there is still truth in the old ways. And not everything nowadays should be modern, upbeat, running around. Look back at the old days because we can learn a lot more from that. Thank you.